The law matters. Of course it does. Hi, I'm Debbie Moraes, your host and moderator. As we tell you, this program has been created to educate, inform, and help you with the law matters because the law matters. Understand the law better, and you're in a better position to decide how to protect yourself, your family, and your business. We continue to provide information and resources that will help you determine whether or not you want to contact a lawyer. Perhaps you'll be able to decide that you can handle some matters yourself. If you do need additional professional counsel, you'll be better prepared, and as a result, so will the professionals you select. Our goal, and either way, our goal is to help you achieve the best possible results while saving time and money. We welcome and continue to thank the Bazar and Associates law firm in East Providence.
Thank you, Deb.
Who every week provide us with information and insights for each of the issues that we tackle. So we say welcome and thanks, David. So today, a different topic that's very timely. It's clear that you can be prosecuted for the things that you do, but can or maybe should you be prosecuted for something that you fail to do as well. In most states, mere failure to report a crime is not a crime in itself. Maybe we need to question that. However, there are exceptions, and in the news, you've seen some of those issues. There are a number of circumstances when you might be exposed to criminal liability, perhaps it's civil liability. So today, who should report what, when, and to whom? And what happens perhaps if ethics and law collide, as it might with lawyers or others? Growing up, children are taught, don't snitch, don't tattle. At other times we hear, see something, say something. So adults often debate what they should do, whether they're just being nosy or whether or not they're obliged to report something. What's appropriate? What's ethical? We know that asking questions, sometimes reporting to authorities, could actually make a difference between life or death. So let's get to it. So David, I don't know if it's the worst, but certainly among the worst are the issues that you hear about scenarios regarding child abuse, I guess not less so elderly abuse or the disabled. Who is a mandatory reporter? What is that? And who's the other kind?
Those are the areas where there are mandatory reporting requirements, and there should be mandatory reporting requirements. The start that you gave to introduce the segment reminded me a little bit actually of the last Seinfeld episodes where they got arrested for not reporting something or doing something about a crime that they were seeing as it was unfolding, and it was sort of the whole series, a lot about nothing, so they didn't do anything, so could they be liable? Well, they had to make believe law that said they were, and it was bordering on silliness, which of course it was supposed to, but this is seriousness. And in this area where there are laws designed to protect, as you said, the elderly, the infirm, young, there are requirements for certain groups who have some responsibilities for those people to report. For example, children. If there is something going on with a child that a teacher or school observes and they have reasonable grounds to think there is something that needs to be reported, they're supposed to contact DCYF and let them know. Same thing with medical providers in the same situation. So it's really based on the relationship in the protected people that we're looking to make sure have a voice.
So it certainly makes sense that certain people and obviously agencies, DCYF has to look out, or they're supposed to look out, parents, teachers you described. And as I was preparing for this, not surprisingly, I saw what seemed to be a fairly lengthy list, and again, not surprising. Daycare workers, dental assistants, emergency medical technicians, family practitioners, nurse practitioners, it goes on and on and on. Social workers, teachers' aides. Those people, it's mandatory. What about if you happen to be they refer to it, the volunteer, the permissive reporter? Permissive meaning it's allowable.
Yep.
You're supposed to do what? You're supposed to call DCYF or supposed to call one of these daycare workers or the next in line to take care of? Who are you supposed to call and when?
Well, if you're not a mandatory reporter, and you just named a whole list of them, but it broadly falls under healthcare providers, teachers, schools, that type of environment. So if you don't fall into the mandatory reporting situation, if you see something that really rises to the level of concern that you think needs to be addressed, you are free in a situation with a child to call the hotline for DCYF and say, hey, something going on, I think someone should go out and look at that. It's interesting, it's like a pendulum and it can swing too far in each direction sometimes. So now you have mandatory reporting for school, for example, and you have a child who you see that seems to be just a little bit off, but you don't really have any real reason to think that there's something untoward going on at home. Do you have to report just a suspicion of something? So there is a fine line. And it reminds me of a case that I was involved with where parents had a child who was somewhat difficult at home, young child, about going to school. So, mom or dad would say, you've got to go to school, or, you'll be punished if you don't. The child goes to school and says, mom or dad threatened to punish me. Do you think that's something that you need necessarily to immediately report to DCYF? I don't think so. I think it requires more common sense and to look into the situation, call mom and dad in, find out what's going on. Because in that particular case, we had a child who was a little bit of an embellisher and sort of made up stories that were not really based in reality. And mom and dad had actually already talked to the school about their concerns about the child not really wanting to go to school and asking for some help from the school as to how they can deal with that, which the school totally ignored. And then on this little information that was no physical things found that would have backed it up and no other factual basis for it, without even speaking to mom or dad, called DCYF. So now DCYF comes out and investigates, and they speak to the parents and the child and all this, and DCYF, to their credit, finds this child's embellishing. It's really the child but the child needed some help. The parents had asked the school for some help, so some help was provided through DCYF to get the child some counseling and care that the parents actually had already set up on their own. And DCYF said, yes, you are taking all the right steps, and that was the end of it, thankfully, in that case. Whereas if a school sees something, a teacher or teacher's aide or any of those other people, that is really of concern, some physical things, a child just repeatedly telling stories about certain situations, and there's some real grounds for believing that, and they don't report that, then the school has violated their responsibilities.
So we hear so much about if you see something, say something, or at least be on alert, tell someone if you need to. If it's the neighbors I mentioned earlier and it's the house next door, they're not sure that there's something going on, but something catches their eye. We're hearing stories about 13 children and how terrible things happened. Maybe nobody saw anything in all of those years. Maybe they did. Who's accountable? Obviously, those neighbors, whoever they are, they're not going to be criminally or civilly liable, but maybe they should have seen something. If you do see something, there are websites such as the childwelfare.gov if it's kids, ncea.acl.gov for elders, and any state.gov agency can help redirect someone. But if you just want to tune in and you do see something that seems untoward, is it okay to call and make an anonymous call? I think something may be awry there. Can you check that out? Is that is that the right thing to do, or should you mind your own business?
Well, if you really see something that is concerning, and it's a child or an elderly person, of a neighbor or whatever, you can call. There's the Department of Children, Youth and Family, and you can call and tell them what the concern is, and then they'll investigate it. And if it's an elderly person, there's the Department of Elderly Affairs, and there's numbers there that you can call. And they will send somebody out if they feel that what's been reported amounts to a situation that needs to be investigated. And so it is the right thing to do if you have legitimate concerns. If you just hear something that is a one-time thing and it doesn't really appear to be much of anything, you probably don't need to report that. But if you see things coming and going that really concern you, in the safety of a child or of an older person, then you should call.
Some of what you're saying obviously sounds like common sense. Sometimes you don't know what you don't know. I think that from what I've been reading here, that it makes sense that as long as you can be aware and use some common sense, there are avenues more than ever in place and ready to follow up on it in ways that the bystander cannot do.
Right. Yeah, and again, as you pointed out, is it a requirement that you say something? Well, not unless you fall into one of those special categories. As a neighbor, just a concerned neighbor, a good neighbor, really, you will not be charged with a crime for not saying something.
Would you know if you wanted to report something, would you likely be able to withhold your name, keep it anonymous, as long as you're still willing to say, I am a neighbor, here's the context, I was in that person's home or whatever. If you can give some context to the story, does that seem like a reasonable way to respond? I'm asking you this, A, as a lawyer, but also just as a person who has common sense here in this situation.
Well, here's what will happen. If you report something, the Department of Children, Youth, and Family, for example, won't reveal to whoever it is that they're going to check on who reported it. So they may tell you, in order to give some credibility to what you're asking them to report, that they need some background in who you are and why you're reporting it. So that's not unreasonable for DCYF in that instance to say, well, we will not tell the person that we're going to investigate who reported this, but we need to know so that we know it's not what the background is. Is it a neighbor who's got some concerns, and what's your name and who are you and how do we know you're the neighbor, and we need to be able to know all those things, as opposed to, and this happens a lot, two people going through a divorce, for example, and one spouse is calling on the other spouse all the time. And if they keep calling, DCYF is going to want to know the background of that situation, so it puts some context into what they're going to investigate.
Let's talk about you, David. So you, as a private citizen, you were, one case could be the neighbor, but you're also an attorney. If someone tells you a story, are you obliged to do anything about it because you are an officer of the court? Or do you do nothing because it's just hearsay, it's not your story, and it's not even your client if it's a neighbor? What are the parameters there, David?
So let's say, for example, hypothetically, a client came in to see me and they were explaining some, what I would consider to be financial elder abuse situation going on. I don't represent the person who is being theoretically abused financially. And I don't even know if the person who was coming in, and let's say they are already my client for something, might be the person who's doing it. So I have a legal, ethical obligation to my client. At the same time, as a person, I have a moral obligation to protecting, if I can, that person who is being taken advantage of. So in that instance, if I'm involved with a client who has intimate knowledge of what's going on and I have concerns about it, I would counsel that client as to what's the right thing to do. And if they aren't the one who is doing it but have some information on that, I would then counsel them to make the report to whoever, Department of Elderly Affairs, or whoever needs to know, so that some protection can be put in place. But it has to weigh and balance my moral obligation as a person against my ethical obligations as an attorney to the person who is my client. And the best I can do is counsel them to do the right thing.
So let's explore that a little bit more. What happens when ethics and legal issues collide? So suppose that person who is your client, with whom you have that attorney-client privilege, is doing the bad thing, whether it's to a child, elderly, or something worse. It's criminal. How do you handle that? What are you obliged to do, maybe even that might prevent a crime from happening? How far does that go? Where do the lines get crossed, David?
So the rules of ethics are very specific on what a lawyer can and cannot do, and there's interpretations of what a lawyer can and cannot do. From, if your client tells you that they are considering or about to commit a murder, and they tell you that in confidence. And now, where does that go? If there's a legitimate expectation that there's somebody who may be placed in harm's way, the ethics rules allows more flexibility to the lawyer than an instance where there isn't an intimate threat to a person. The murder had been committed, they know where the body is. You really would like the family of the victim to know what's going on and what's happened. In that instance, there's no immediate threat to someone. Your confidentiality requirements are much more bound up in the rules of ethics of what you can and cannot say, which is you cannot really say anything under those circumstances. So you have to look at the actual factual pattern that's presented to you. The abuse to the elderly, if it's your client who's doing it and you are counseling your client every which way, including, there's possibility of criminal charges that can be brought against you, we can resolve these, we can get out in front of this. You're doing both things. You're trying to give your client good legal counsel and also counsel them to do the right thing.
So you have a duty to protect, a duty to warn, and you're trying to adhere to that. But obviously looks like it could be a sticky wicket sometimes.
It's very difficult. And it's not a black and white, there's gray area, and sometimes if an attorney is in that certain circumstance, you might want to consult with a disciplinary counsel or anyone who's an expert in the rules of ethics and just make sure that you follow what you need to do.
What happens now if someone is witness to a crime? Are they a mandatory reporter? If they don't report, are they aiding and abetting? How does that play out, David?
Yeah, so now again, you're in a fine area, and a lot of the different things that will apply to that particular case really involve situations like, what is your relationship to this situation? Again, you fall into that line of mandatory reporter. Is it something that you just happened to see and you were there? And I'll give you an example of a case many, many years ago that I had. My client was working in a house. He was in the basement, I think changing the furnace or something. And the police came down and said, "Did you see anybody come down this way?" He's just minding his own business, and he said, "I didn't see anything, I'm just changing the furnace." And a few minutes later, they found someone hiding in the basement. So they charged him with obstruction of justice. And he won that case because, first of all, they had to prove, first of all, what was his obligation to say or do anything? And then they had to prove that he knew that that guy was down there, which there was no proof. I don't even know if he knew the guy was down there. I wouldn't have asked him that.
Sure.
But there was no proof that he knew that someone was hiding in the basement. And even if he did, what was his obligation? So he didn't stop them from doing their job. He didn't tell them, "Don't look down here." It's not like he was playing hide and seek with them and saying, "You won't find him in that corner over there, so don't look over there." He didn't interfere in any way. So did he have an obligation, a proactive obligation to say something? In that instance, no. So what are the facts? Is there a proactive duty to do something as just a person, who happens to be in a particular place at a particular time?
And if someone does know what's going on, I guess things vary from state to state, and people should check out what the laws are, or check with an attorney or whatever if they're the bystander. But if you happen to be a bystander and there's an occasion when you might be held accountable, it's maybe a misdemeanor. If you didn't report it and something happened, serious injury, do you end up having to counsel someone, yes, you should come forward, you should report that because?
Well, that just reminds me of some different areas of the law. Obviously, if you have a car accident, for example, and you hit somebody or something, you have an obligation to report it. But you've been involved in that situation. There's a duty to stop and find out what you did and what happened and call the police, call rescue, render aid. And then we can get into the Good Samaritan laws on what happens if you render aid and all of that. But the bottom line is it depends on, as I was saying before, the given situation and what it is and, where, as you say, where it is as to what your obligation is.
I assume that it's very different if you not only saw a person being shot But if you were in possession of the gun later that shot the person, you didn't shoot them, but does that not change the nature of your general obligation ethically or legally to report it?
Of course, because now you've gone from an innocent bystander who really had nothing to do with the situation, and of course, now you get into the investigation and what you can and cannot do to aid or hurt the investigation. You can't do anything that misleads or hurts or not tell the police the truth if you're going to speak to the police about something, because now that does fall into obstructing justice and that type of thing. But what you described is more of someone who's actually involved in a criminal activity, as they say, post the crime, so
Yes.
that if you actively hide someone from the police who's committed a crime, if you have evidence and you're holding a weapon, for example, that was used in the commission of a crime, and you hide that, that in and of itself is a criminal act.
If someone is accused of failing to report a criminal offense, is this a DIY, do-it-yourself way of defending yourself? Can you do it yourself, or do you really need a lawyer if that should happen?
Well, now we're talking about what situation you're at and where you're involved with it.
You just failed to report it. You
Yeah.
saw it.
Right.
You're not holding the gun. You
Yeah.
just happened to see the bad thing happen, whatever
Right.
that bad thing is.
Right.
So if I'm accused, if it's me, if I'm accused of failing to report a criminal offense, can I just justify or defend myself by saying, well, I didn't really feel obliged to do that. It's not my responsibility. Or do I need you to defend me?
If you're accused of something by the police, you always want to have an attorney so you know exactly what the rules are, what the proper approach to something is. For example, what's the situation? If you're driving down the road and you see someone driving recklessly and you think that they're drunk and then they end up hitting a car and killing somebody, do you have an obligation to stop your car, pull over, wait for the police to come, and then report what you saw? I mean, should you? Probably. But is it a legal obligation? You were 25 cars back when it happened and you just saw what you saw. Most people are going to keep driving on, and I don't think that that amounts to a crime. If you had some more involvement than just happening to be in the slow speed lane when they went by in the high speed lane, then yes, if there's more involvement, there might be an obligation. But it's fact driven, so you have to have specific facts for it. And again, now we're going to go back to what's the right thing to do and what's the required legal thing to do. If you see someone driving erratically down the road and you suspect that they're may be under the influence, the right thing to do is to call the police and say, hey, I saw this green car go by with such and such a license plate driving erratically. I think you should be aware of that.
You bring up an interesting springboard for me to ask a different question, which is, let's say it's the 10th car back, but let's say it's not about a hit and run or something. Let's say in these circumstances that we're hearing now, even with the Olympics, it's not the inner circle, which has some mandatory reporting requirements, but now there's a secondary, tertiary. Now there are 3 or 4 more orbits of people who are somehow involved with the girls, the doctor, the university. How far, it seems that this needs to be an expanding ring of accountability, maybe ethical, maybe legal, but for example, the University of Michigan story, the woman is resigning. She's not legally held accountable in the story about the young athletes and the abuse by that doctor. But certainly there's another circle that says someone's holding her accountable, namely the people who are chairman on the board of whatever of that university. Should there be an expanding orbit of people who are held accountable if they're the 10th car in the line or the 3rd?
Michigan State.
Michigan State.
So, I think, right?
Yes.
So, there's a difference between being held responsible based on your position to an institution or some other place where you work, as opposed to legal responsibility criminally.
Yes, she's not criminally accountable.
Correct. She's not criminally responsible for what went on. I don't even know if she was there when it happened or if she knew or what position she was in. But there's a legal responsibility to the institution and your duty to them, and that's a whole different situation, as you know, with employment and duty to your employer and that type of thing, and they have to do what's right for their institution, and that's a different situation than you being criminally liable. Now, on that rings, as you say, as they go out, and also it's similar to the situation that happened at Penn State.
Yes.
And so,
Good example.
did the coach of Penn State, not the one who was doing what was going on, but who was the head of it, should he have known, and would he have had criminal responsibility if he did know and didn't report it? Because he wasn't the teacher of those kids, but he saw something. Certainly there's an ethical obligation, without a doubt. And again, just like the president of that university was held responsible, the school should or would have, or didn't, I don't think initially, but it would have held that coach responsible for what was happening on his watch, so to speak. Broadening it out to assistant coaches and voluntary staff members and all of that, what is their obligation, what is their role in it? The farther out it goes, the less duty you have legally, but the same responsibility morally.
Very well put. And just in the brief amount of time we have left, at the corporate level, there are rules and regs: no smoking in the courtyard or in the school building, in the place of employment. You see it, you may say something, gee, David, you're not supposed to smoke here, it's not right. There are protections for whistleblowers. What's ethical, what's legal? They're not going to be fired, but could they be? They're not supposed to be.
No.
Shut up or what?
No, again, it's really just whatever the right thing is. You should always try to do the right thing. It's, if you see something happening to an elderly person, a young child, or infirm, whatever, you should report it if you think that it's something that is wrong. If you see someone doing something wrong at work and it violates a workplace, I would talk to that person first, but if no one listens, that's what supervisors are for.
HR or whatever.
Right.
And at the corporate level, there's even more of it. Certainly there are more options now so that people can report or get others involved,
Right.
as they should. Last question, quick question. Do you see that there are more people in the workplace who have HR facilities that make it easier for someone to report and yet not be in trouble?
Yeah, and again, it depends on the size of the place of employment, but there's in a bigger employer situation, there's always a handbook and rules to follow, and you should always follow the rules. But even in a smaller place, it's hopefully intimate enough that if it's so small, you can just go right to the boss and say, hey, I don't want to create problems here, and I just think this is something you should know because you're responsible for what goes on here.
Good to know. Thank you. We hope that this has been helpful to you. We hope that you will stay tuned to The Law Matters as we continue to have the discussion, because the law matters to you.